China has a plan for world domination. That plan requires oil. China has been getting some of it from Sudan. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. China is colonizing Africa with trade, aid, and debt-trap diplomacy. And this is bad news, not just for the people of Africa, but for Europe and the United States as well. In many cases, these are brutal dictatorships the Chinese Communist Party is supporting. It's part of what China calls the Belt and Road Initiative. That's a $1 trillion investment plan that traps developing countries in debt, essentially turning them into slaves of the Chinese regime. But the Belt and Road needs oil to chug along. And for many years, that oil has been coming from Sudan. Sudan is making some democratic reforms now, but it still isn't exactly a free country. For decades, it was ruled by an Islamist regime under Omar al-Bashir. In 2018, a nonviolent revolution began, and by 2019, it had managed to oust Bashir. One of the men at the forefront of the revolution is Mohamed Nagi Alassam, a 28-year-old Sudanese medical doctor. He led the longest doctors' strike in history. He joins me today via Skype from Sudan to talk about China's influence in the changing Sudan and the impact it has on the rest of the world. Thanks for joining me, Mohamed.
Thank you for having me.
So, you were at the forefront of a revolution to cast off decades of Islamic dictatorship in Sudan. That was a regime that received a lot of financial and military support from China. How do people in Sudan feel about the Chinese Communist Party now?
Yeah, so the Chinese government has lent a very helpful hand to the previous regime. After the sanctions put by the US and after Sudan was put in the terrorist list, countries supporting terrorism, the only hand given to the previous regime government was mainly from China. So they would somehow bypass those sanctions and had given the previous regime huge amount of loans and support, even armed weapons and all of that kind of support.
And how did that influence Sudan?
So the previous regime, especially in the last 10 years or so from its life, they just went on for anything they could have help from. And they were on survival mode. And that has actually impacted the Sudanese economy in large. So now Sudan has $60 billion plus million in debts. And that's largely due to the previous regime actions that just took money from anyone around the world just for survival. And now we are very, very impacted by these loans and by this economic crisis that we are still living.
And are there Chinese companies like Huawei that have a big presence there?
Yes, actually Huawei is the main telecommunication company that is controlling the market here, especially that they have no rivals in the market. We have large networks in the market, and with Huawei being there, controlling the market mainly, without any opposing other networks or companies.
Do you think Chinese investment has benefited the people of Sudan?
I think it mainly helped the previous regime to survive by giving them loans, and now we have to repay those loans. We all the time during the days of the previous regime, we would hear that they have given the government so and so $1 million, so and so $1 billion, but it's hardly seen in the daily lives of the Sudanese people. They had projects that they have helped establish, like the Marawi Dam, which is a hydraulic dam that generates power in Sudan. Yes, it helped, but still, with the loans not paid yet, we know now for sure that China has $2 billion plus in debt for Sudan. This is the numbers that at least I know, but we are not yet very sure about how deeply they are enrooted in the Sudanese economy and their interest. Of course, China has its Belt and Road Initiative, and the Red Sea is a major part of that initiative. And their main interest in Sudan is definitely economic interest, nothing other than that. So we believe now, after the change has happened in Sudan, after the revolution, that they may want Sudan to be stable because of that economic interest they have in Sudan and generally in Africa, of course. For us, we want it to be that way. We don't mind them having an interest in Sudan, an economic interest in Sudan, but not without the benefit of the Sudanese people. We don't want their bargains that would only benefit China and not benefiting the Sudanese people.
Did the investment create jobs for the Sudanese people?
Another sector that China has invested a lot in Sudan is the oil sector, of course, especially before the separation of South Sudan after the referendum of 2011. Those years were definitely benefiting the Sudanese people, created a lot of jobs, as I said before, especially with the sanctions put by the US. China and India dominated the oil sector for years until 2011. But of course, after 2011, the economy itself has somehow reached downfall because Sudan lost its main revenue producing sector, which was oil before the separation of South Sudan, that now has the majority of oil fields.
Well, when South Sudan became independent in 2011, how did that affect Chinese investment in Sudan and then South Sudan?
Yeah, that was seen to have a huge effect on even the Sudan-Chinese relationships after the independence of South Sudan. The interest of China has largely decreased in Sudan because they were the main importer of the Sudanese oil. They were investing in the fields themselves and importing the oils from Sudan. So after that, the economic relationships between Sudan and China decreased by large after the independence of South Sudan, and they are mainly focused now in South Sudan as investors.
Is that affecting the relationship between Sudan and South Sudan?
Yes, in the years before the revolution, it had a lot of tensions. A lot of tensions happened between Sudan and South Sudan over the issues of oil, fuels. Sudan has the pipes that connects the production sites to the Red Sea for the exports, but and that has somehow issued a lot of tensions between Sudan and South Sudan related to the prices of the transport of this oil and the prices demanded by Sudan for their pipes and all of that. And it has created a lot of tensions indeed.
So how has the Chinese regime dealt with the fall of Sudan's dictator, Omar al-Bashir?
Yeah, they were given huge support for the previous regime. And ironically, you know that Sudan was ruled by an Islamist regime that regarded the communist parties or the communist ideology in general as forbidden. And the Communist Party, even in Sudan, was forbidden from practicing politics. But they had a very good relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. Even they had direct meetings between the NCP, which is the Islamist party, ruled Sudan for 30 years, directly with the Chinese Communist Party. And this is very ironic, actually.
Yeah, I'm curious, since the Chinese Communist Party is officially atheist and has persecuted Muslims in China, it seems strange that an Islamist regime would be allied with the Communist Party.
Yeah, I think it's just economic interest. So it really shows how the regime in Sudan, the ideology that they used as Islamist was just fraud ideology. They didn't even believe in what they were saying or doing. So it was just to buy their politics and their agendas to the common Sudanese citizen. But in fact, they had a very good relationship with China and with the Chinese Communist Party. Although even in Sudan, the Sudanese Communist Party was forbidden from practicing politics. during their days.
I know Sudan has been called China's foothold in Africa. What's China's goal in Africa?
I think the Africa in general is the it is now, and it will increase in the coming days. It will be the continent that the large powers in the world will compete against each other on their influence in general, and it's mainly economic interest for these great powers. Russia, China, and slightly the US has a great influence in Africa now, and this competition will increase definitely in the coming days. Of course, China has its project, the Belt and Road Initiative, that Africa is a huge part of, and they want to make sure that that this project will have its foothold in Africa. And Sudan is the connection between the Middle East, between Asia, between the Arab world and the Africa. And it's strategic for any nation that wants to have an influence and a foothold in Africa in general.
I know the Chinese regime typically offers support to questionable regimes that other countries don't want to do business with, especially in Africa. Does that make it harder for these countries to reform?
Yes, definitely. The dictatorships in general, which are still in Africa, they want these sort of direct economic relationships without regard to human rights or democracy or citizen rights or whatsoever. And China is one of the nations in the world that provides that to dictatorships in general. That's why it still has very good relations with many African nations that has dictatorships in them, and indeed they have supported the previous regime largely. But on the other hand, also the West nations, the nations that call for democracy and human rights in the world, they have also responsibility. And they are also part of this Chinese increasing influence of China in general, because they do not show the support needed for the democratic nations in this desert of dictatorships. And they also do not show the support needed for the pro-democracy movements in general in Africa. And that gives a larger chance for China and for other nations like China, who just wants economic interest without any regard to human rights, to increase their influence and to strengthen their relationships.
So in 2017, the Trump administration lifted almost 2 decades of sanctions on Sudan. Has that made the U.S. a competing power in Sudan?
The sanctions on Sudan are still there. Sudan is still, even after more than a year after its revolution and after transitional authority was established, and after embracing the human rights values and working very hard to establish sustainable democracy in Sudan, Sudan is still in the state sponsor of terrorism list. And that is affecting hardly the situation in Sudan. It is hardly affecting the democratic transition in Sudan. And it's preventing any chance, actually, of economic reforms or economic makeup of the very and largely fallen economy in Sudan. So that is the example that I was telling you before, that this lack of direct engagement with democracies or even countries going through transition to democracy, and that lack of support actually hinders any hope of democratic transition in Africa in general, which is still full of dictatorships, and also gives larger chance for China and other nations to engage with these countries because they don't have any restrictions dealing with whatsoever authority or whatsoever regime.
Well, so what will it mean for the rest of the world if China continues to gain power and influence over Africa?
I think for us, at least, for Africa and for African nations, we still do not see the risk of the Chinese influence, or actually the risk of any large influence of any country whatsoever on our continent. And I believe we are entering a new era of colonization, if I may say. Economic means through loans and through huge amount of debts, and African nations are now struggling through that. So that can hinder any process of improvement in any nation whatsoever. But I think we as Africans, we do not see that yet very clearly, because the very bad situations we are living in, economic situations, do not allow us to see that. So we still deal economically with any country, any nation that can lend us a hand of help, because we are in this deep crisis.
Well, great. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching, and a special thank you to the Oslo Freedom Forum for helping arrange this interview. Every year, the Oslo Freedom Forum hosts an event where activists from around the world, like Mohamed Nagi Alassam, talk about standing up to authoritarian regimes. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.